Couldn't the appearances of Jesus after his crucifixion have been hallucinations?
This has been suggested by a number of critics, but I think there are some insuperable problems with the hallucination hypothesis. Number one, the wide variety of the locations, the circumstances, and the witnesses to these appearances belie the hallucination hypothesis. Jesus was not just seen on one occasion, but on many occasions. Not just by one individual, but by many persons. Not just by single persons, but by actual groups of people. Not at one locale and circumstance, but at many different places and under many different circumstances. And this wide variety of circumstances, people, locale, and so forth, I think simply makes the hallucination hypothesis quite improbable. A second problem with the hallucination hypothesis is that I think we have good grounds for affirming the historical credibility of the gospel accounts of these appearances. And these appearances were clearly physical and bodily appearances. I do not think that you can dismiss this element of the narrative as being merely legendary, because it is unanimous throughout the narratives, it's consistent, and also the date of the Gospels is too close to the time of the events recorded to have allowed such a total corruption of non-physical appearances into this consistent and unanimous tradition of physical appearances. So the very physicality of the resurrection appearances, I think, undercuts the hallucination hypothesis. A third problem with the hallucination theory is that I do not think it accounts for why the disciples came to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. You see, the Jewish concept of resurrection differed from the resurrection of Jesus in that the Jewish conception was always a resurrection after the end of the world, at the end of history, and it was always a general resurrection of all the people, never of an isolated individual. But in Jesus' case, you had the resurrection of an isolated individual within history, something which was simply unknown in Judaism. The Jewish frame of thought had another category which would have nicely explained hallucinations if the disciples had had them, namely the notion of assumption into heaven or translation into heaven. Certain Old Testament figures such as Enoch and Elijah did not physically die, but were assumed directly into heaven. And this category could be applied to recently deceased persons as well as living ones. So that had the disciples seen hallucinations of Jesus, they would have seen hallucinations of Jesus glorified in Abram's bosom or in paradise. This is where the souls of the righteous dead went to be with God when they died. And seeing hallucinations of Jesus glorified like this would at most have led the disciples to proclaim the assumption or the translation of Jesus into heaven, not his resurrection from the dead, which went decisively contrary to Jewish thinking in at least two fundamental respects. And finally, number four, the hallucination hypothesis says nothing to explain the fact of the empty tomb. You have to conjoin some additional independent hypothesis to the hallucination theory in order to explain the empty tomb. But the single hypothesis of Jesus' resurrection from the dead explains both the appearances and the empty tomb, and therefore has greater explanatory scope and simplicity, and is therefore the preferred explanation. And therefore, for reasons such as these, I think that the hallucination hypothesis is not the best explanation of the evidence.